Hello again, everyone. Edwin Learnard back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I'm going to be talking about astrology and the death of Courtney Heater. Now, on February 2nd, 2020, Courtney Heater of Nakina, North Carolina, died according to a report due to inadvertent fentanyl and heroin intoxication. Now, at the time, her boyfriend had called a report in. There are questions regarding her death. Now, many speculate that the boyfriend had something to do with this and perhaps forced her to assimilate that heroin and the fentanyl. And there was very little investigation, if any, done into this, into her death. I would say, it was a very superficial investigation at best, and that it's something where someone from law enforcement in that area had stated that neighbors had been questioned. Now, however, one neighbor stated that he or she never was questioned by an investigator. And now, more than 2 years after her death, the family and close friends of Courtney want answers. In this video, I'm going to look at some of her natal placements and transits that may be connected with what happened to her on this day. Now, first off, she has Pluto, the planet of death, in Scorpio at the anaretic 29th degree in her third house. Now, Pluto in the third house by itself can manifest in a death that may be on the news. In fact, it's in Scorpio. The fact that it's in Scorpio may increase the propensity of this being connected with murder and a death that was perhaps done in a surreptitious manner. Now, the 29th degree can represent the culmination of the planet and sign. This could make the energy much more intensified and powerful. Now, the fact that it's retrograde can suggest that there would be a delay in the investigation of her death. Now, 29 degrees in astrology can indicate too much or too little of something. Now, in this case, this may have been expressed in too little investigation into her death. There may not have been enough passion and emotional intensity, which is Pluto, involved in the investigation of her death, which may have been murder, and that is associated with Scorpio. Now, Pluto makes an opposition to her sun in Gemini. Now, this could suggest an exceptional lack of control because Pluto is associated with control from one's life, which is the sun, and Pluto is far away, furthest distance away by aspect from her sun. Opposition is the furthest aspect you can have, the biggest aspect in astrology. And the fact that it's opposing the sun in Gemini, that could be, a life which she may have expressed with much vivaciousness, animation, versatility, and adaptability. And with the dominant mutable influence in her chart in general, she may have been exceptionally adaptable, but sadly may have been easily influenced by others and coerced and even bullied, sadly. Now, what I notice is that she has Sagittarius on the fourth house cusp of the end of life. Now, in some instances, this could be expressed in the end of life being fortuitous and prosperity associated with it. But in this case, sadly, it may have manifested in the end of life being associated perhaps with prevarication on a very grand scale. And I think too it has something, the fact that she has Sagittarius on the cusp of her fourth house has something to do with just the enlargement of the issues in general that are associated with her end of life. Now, the ruler of that fourth house, Jupiter, is in the fourth house. Now, the end of life, I believe, occurred in her home. That's something I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that's where it was. But Jupiter retrograde does suggest that people in the law, because Jupiter is associated with the law, it suggests that those people may be going the other way. And the fact that, looking the other way, and also with Jupiter being in Sagittarius, These people in the law may have been ones that were very self-righteous. Now, let's see what else your chart. Hold on a moment, people. Now, another thing too is that with this Jupiter, being in Sagittarius again, those people may have been very self-righteous. Now, Jupiter is also one of the rulers of her seventh house, and this could be an indicator that this death may have been done. What I believe is a murder, ostensibly, may have been done by someone that she was in a relationship with, because the seventh house rules relationships, and again, one of those rulers falls in her fourth house of the end of life. And the thing too is, sadly, I look at this, Sagittarius on the fourth house cusp may indicate that she was very jocular, optimistic, jovial, breezy, and expansive at the core. The fourth house cusp represents who we are, who can be at the core. And another thing too is that Courtney had Pisces on the cusp of her seventh house. Now, sadly, this may be expressed in relationships that are deceptive and duplicitous, and she may have been oblivious to the shortcomings of people that she was involved in. Now, this placement can indicate attracting people that are habitual alcohol or drug users, or could be addicted to other things. Now, Saturn in Pisces in the seventh may have difficulties in restrictions in relationships. Now, Saturn, again, is about restrictions, and Pisces is associated with incarceration. So it's likely she had been, could be restricted and confined, which is Saturn. It could be due to being, a prisoner in a way, which is Pisces, to the person that may have murdered her, and again does fall in the seventh house of relationships. And I'm saying this because I believe she was murdered, even though it's not classified as a murder. That may have murdered her. Now, with the Moon in Pisces in the seventh house, this combination may be expressed in a very moody and temperamental partner. It's the Moon, and then with wide mood swings, and that would be super sensitive, and you have a little of Piscean energy blended in. It could also indicate a significant other that may have been involved with drugs and alcohol, because that is strongly synonymous with the zodiac sign Pisces. I'm going to look a little more, people. Hold on momentarily. Now, another thing is that Courtney had Aries on the cusp of her eighth house of death, and this by itself can suggest volatile conditions at the time of death. Now, her body had extensive bruising and injuries on it. She also had Venus in Taurus in the eighth house. Now, this could be an indicator that someone she was in a relationship with may have done this. Venus is in greedy and avaricious Taurus. The South Node makes a conjunction to it, and that could make the placement even more detrimental. The ruler of the eighth house of death is Mars, and that's in the 12th house of the hidden and unknown. That may figure prominently as to why the death has more mystery to it. And Mars also squares her Pluto. Now, this could be an indicator as to why people in law enforcement were adversarial toward investigating her death. Mars can have a connection with law enforcement, and Pluto is connected with death. Now, with Venus in Taurus in the eighth house, looking at that superficially, that would appear to be an indicator of a very peaceful and tranquil death. Now, that is not always the case. In this particular instance, I wonder if there may have been greater avarice and greed tied into her death, and if she was indeed murdered. Now, was there money taken from her at this time? Now, Venus can also have a connection with the law. Now, in this case, it could have been people involved in the law that were lazy, that were indolent, which is associated with Taurus. Now, interestingly enough, it opposes her third house cusp which rules neighbors. Now, somebody in law enforcement in that area had stated that the neighbors had been interviewed, but one neighbor stated he or she was not interviewed. The opposition can indicate people prominent in the law were very far away from her neighbors. Hold on a moment, please. Sorry about that, I'm back, but anyway. But transit Mars in Sagittarius was traversing her fourth house of the end of life at the time of her death. Now, Mars rules physical injuries and violence. There were extensive injuries on her body at this time. Now, being in Sagittarius, this may have been done very recklessly and in a foolhardy manner. I don't know this, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was bruising on her hips and thigh area, since those body parts are associated with Sagittarius. Now, transit Mars also made a tight square to her natal Chiron in Virgo, which is in the first house of the physical body. Now, this may have indicated that suffering due to these injuries may have been harder to deal with. Now, there was a podcast about her death, and there was something was stated about her having precise injuries, and that could only come from being tied to a chair. Now, Chiron is in Virgo again, the sign of precision, in the first house of the physical body, and conjoins the ascendant. Now, next up, say at the time of her death, now transit Pluto was making a conjunction to her Neptune. Now, this is a strong indicator that the death was drug related. The fact that it's in Capricorn may indicate it was in a manner that was very cold, callous, and premeditated. The transit falls in the fifth house of romance and lovers. Now, transit Saturn also made a tight conjunction to her natal Neptune. That could be an aspect of limitations in compassion, and it could also manifest in an older person being responsible for the drugs administered in her system. Now, interestingly enough, now transit Sun in Aquarius in the fifth house made an inconjunct aspect to her Virgo ascendant at the time of her death. Now, inconjunct aspects can indicate too much or too little of something. In this case, I believe it may have manifested in too little focus, which focus being connected to the Sun, on the unusual, which is Aquarius, behavior from a lover, which is the fifth house, and how this may have been tied in with the condition of her physical body, which is the ascendant. Now, ironically enough, her ascendant is in Virgo, the sign associated with meticulousness, and now it's safe to say the investigators did anything but a meticulous job looking at the condition of her physical body at the time she died. Now, if any of those bruises occurred in close proximity to the time she died, the investigators should have understood that the person that did that could also have been very capable of killing her. Now, another thing too, I want to say looking at this a little more, another aspect I found, which I would say is compelling, was transit Mercury in Aquarius in the sixth house, opposing her natal Mars and Leo in the 12th house. Now, this could manifest in communications, which is Mercury, that were bizarre and unusual, which is Aquarius, associated with the health, which is the sixth house of Courtney, and opposing law enforcement, which is Mars. That may have actually been arrogant or felt too superior, which is Leo. She has Mars and Leo, to do this investigation, and it's in the 12th house of limitations. Mercury also rules breathing, oddly enough. Now, the boyfriend, to my understanding, did not attempt to provide CPR and claims to not know whether she was breathing or not. Now, another thing too is that she also had a transit Neptune in Pisces in the 7th house at the time of her death. Now, this by itself can manifest as having difficulty in deciphering the motives and intentions of other people. This transit also made a conjunction to her natal moon in Pisces. Now, not to be overly, I guess you could say, morbid or morose, but this may be an indicator of the dissolving or dissipation, which is Neptune, of one's soul, and the soul being connected with the moon. With her moon being in Pisces, it may have been a soul that was very compassionate, sometimes naive, but idealistic, altruistic, and sacrificing and forgiving as well. Now, transit Neptune also made a square to her natal Mercury in Gemini at the time of her death. Communications in general may have been more cryptic and ambiguous. This may have made thinking more chaotic at the time. It could have also indicated that being imprisoned, which is Neptune, by a person may have conflicted with her wanting to communicate, which is Mercury, and being in Gemini, manifold things. Now, another thing too is that about this. Now, if a person, I mean, what I want to say is it may have also been more difficult to see deception and duplicity, and one may be easily deceived and bamboozled, and I'm talking about the transit of Neptune squaring her natal Mercury. And transit Venus in Pisces made a conjunction to her natal Saturn. Now, the conjunction by itself may have made Courtney feel very alone and desolate at this time, sadly. And what doesn't help is the fact it's in the sign of isolation, Pisces. It could also indicate that someone she was in a relationship with, which is Venus, was causing fear, restriction, and inhibition, which is Saturn. Being in Pisces, again, this may have been connected with a form of imprisonment. Anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment, and until next time, Edwin Learnard saying stay well.